On this week's episode of Friend Code, I'm doing a spotlight on Super Mario 64. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to a new episode of Friend Code. This one's a little bit of a special episode. I'm going to be talking about Super Mario 64. Going forward, we'll try and have more of the allies involved with this, but due to the nature of this being the first one, and I wanted to try it out, I decided to just go with just my opinion on this, kind of my own voice. So anyway, without further ado, spotlight on Super Mario 64. In case you haven't noticed, I really like Super Mario 64. It's one of my go-to games for streaming when I can't think of anything else to play, and I often find myself with a sudden desire to play through the entire game for fun. What is it about Super Mario 64 that continuously draws me to it? How can I play it this much and still want to come back to it so often? These are just a few of the questions I hope to address as I take a closer look at just what makes Super Mario 64 so special to me. For those of you who haven't listened to previous episodes of Friend Code, I explained my first experience with both Super Mario 64 and the Nintendo 64. The system launched back in 1996 in North America, and didn't actually get the system until shortly after its launch. However, I got a chance to try out the Nintendo 64 a bit earlier at Toys R Us, one of the ones that had those kiosks where you could play Super Mario 64. To my surprise, I actually had a difficult time playing the game at first, especially just trying to run in a straight line in the game's first level. Despite the setbacks, I simply had to have more. So when I finally got my own Nintendo 64, with Super Mario 64 in October of that year, you couldn't pull me away from the thing. After school, I would rush up to my room and continue my adventure further into Peach's castle in an attempt to collect the 70 Power Stars needed to confront Bowser. I never experienced anything quite like Super Mario 64, and it had a profound impact on the way I viewed games. Now, let's back up a bit real quick. You see, Super Mario 64 was the first Nintendo game where you could move around freely in a fully realized three-dimensional world. Sure, Star Fox gets a lot of credit for realizing 3D visuals back on the Super Nintendo, and being an early example of a 3D effort, but it was nothing to the degree of Super Mario 64. In fact, during the transition to the Nintendo 64, a lot of the pre-launch chatter revolved around whether or not Nintendo could successfully realize their beloved 2D side-scrollers and adventure games in 3D. Super Mario 64 would be the first, and it would set the tone for the system. If Nintendo failed to convert Mario into 3D, then it would have cast a huge shadow over the Nintendo 64's future. As it turned out, Super Mario 64 earned rave reviews from fans and critics alike, and is cited as a landmark release in the history of gaming by helping to pave the way for future 3D platformers. It's also one of my favorite games of all time, and one that I place near the top of my personal best games of all time list. Despite being an adamant supporter of classic 2D games, Super Mario 64 is one of the few 3D games where I would say I prefer it over any of its 2D incarnations. Yes, I believe Super Mario 64 is superior to both Super Mario World and Super Mario Bros. 3. Usually in a critical review, we go over lots of different areas of the game, including the mechanics, the design, the visuals, soundtrack, and other elements that are crucial to the experience. What I love the most about Super Mario 64, and why I feel it is such an excellent game, is its absolutely phenomenal levels, which feel like 3D playgrounds that gave me a sense of freedom in a platformer unlike anything before it, and something I've rarely seen since. I know some will point to another stellar Nintendo 64 platformer, Banjo-Kazooie, and the larger degree of freedom you have in each of that game's worlds. While I agree that it offers you more in the way of being able to complete multiple objectives at once, and that's an impressive accomplishment, I maintain to this day that the game is simply not as fun to play as Super Mario 64. To me, it feels like the worlds in Super Mario 64 were designed as obstacle courses where I'm encouraged to try out my platforming abilities, whereas Banjo-Kazooie feels more like a scripted adventure where I'm being strung along by the narrative and objectives doled out by the NPCs. One game affords me a sense of freedom and encourages me to play around. The other is tugging me in specific directions. And when it comes to a platformer, I prefer the former. One of the things I value the most in a game is when I'm given the opportunity to tackle objectives in more ways than one. But I especially love it when I can't tell if the way I completed an objective was the way the game intended me to or not. Whenever this happens, I'll hop onto YouTube or Twitch to watch various playthroughs and compare what I did to others. Seeing how drastically different each of us would reach a star was one of the most amazing things I had seen in a game. The fact that, in my opinion, this still holds true over 2 decades later is one of the strongest testaments to my belief and why Super Mario 64 is such a great game. Despite the advances in 3D Mario games in Super Mario 64, I still prefer the platforming mechanics of the Nintendo 64 Classic. I can see that it may be nostalgia, or it may be the fact it was my first 3D game, and I'm just so familiar with it. Or perhaps it's a bit of both. But I still prefer the way Mario handles in Super Mario 64 over any other 3D Mario game. I feel that the newer incarnations are more restrictive, removing some degree of freedom with Mario's movements. I present to you the following 2 quirky examples as evidence. Whether it's my fascination with doing forward momentum backflips, or long jumps that go in reverse, these 2 guilty pleasures have never been possible again in any future 3D Mario game. Additionally, I believe I had more control over Mario's trajectory and a higher degree of flexibility in his range of movements. As Nintendo refined Mario's movement and jumping abilities in future games, to me it felt like they reeled the controls in a bit to accommodate the designs of each new installment. Mario's base controls felt sluggish and slower in these newer incarnations. Couple this with the fact that I feel the 3D Mario games have gotten more linear in design, almost to the point where they're trying to replicate the feel of traditional 2D courses, and I hope you can begin to understand why I adore Super Mario 64. The closest game to it since was Super Mario Sunshine, but each subsequent entry got further and further away from what I loved about the original. That's not to say I dislike the other games in the series, especially Super Mario Galaxy and its sequel. In fact, I think they're some of the best games ever made. I just prefer the design and the platforming elements of Super Mario 64 over these other 3D Mario games. This is probably why I'm so excited about what I've seen and played in Super Mario Odyssey. It's more in line with something akin to Super Mario 64 and Sunshine than the newer installments, even if it's not exactly like Super Mario 64. It's leaning towards that style of 3D Mario that I enjoy so much. To see any new installment draw heavily upon Super Mario 64 for inspiration is enough to make me feel optimistic about its outlook. So there you have it, why I love Super Mario 64 so much, and what I see in this game each time I jump back into this N64 classic. Oh yeah, I also love the music in this game, and I like Peach's castle as a hub world, and all of the secrets it has too. So now maybe you have a better understanding of why I always place this game on such a lofty pedestal.